The wind howled through the towering pines like a chorus of banshees, driving snow so thick that Ezra McKinnon could barely see his own gloved hands gripping the reins. His horse, a sturdy Mustang named Ghost, picked its way carefully down the treacherous mountain path, each step calculated and sure despite the blinding storm. Ezra pulled his wool coat tighter around his broad shoulders, his weathered face hidden beneath the brim of his worn hat. At 43, he had spent the better part of 2 decades in these Colorado mountains, trapping, hunting, and avoiding the complications that came with civilization. The isolation suited him fine, had suited him ever since the war ended, and he'd decided that the company of men held more pain than peace. Ghost suddenly stopped, his ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring despite the freezing air. Ezra's hand instinctively moved to the rifle secured to his saddle. In these mountains, a horse's instincts often meant the difference between life and death. "What is it, boy?" Ezra's voice was gravelly from disuse, barely audible above the wind. That's when he saw it, a dark shape against the white expanse, partially buried in a snowdrift near a cluster of aspen trees. His first thought was that it might be a fallen deer, but as Ghost moved closer, Ezra's breath caught in his throat. It was a woman. She lay face down in the snow, her long dark hair spread around her like spilled ink. Her dress, once probably blue calico, was torn and stained with both mud and what looked sickeningly like dried blood. Even through the falling snow, Ezra could see the angry red welts crisscrossing her back where the fabric had been shredded. He dismounted quickly, his boots crunching through the snow as he knelt beside her still form. With gentle hands, surprisingly gentle for a man who had grown accustomed to handling only rifles and traps, he brushed the snow from her face. She was young, maybe 25, with delicate features that spoke of both beauty and recent suffering. Her lips were blue with cold, but he could see the faint mist of her breath in the frigid air. "Mom?" He touched her shoulder carefully, avoiding the obvious wounds. "Mom, can you hear me?" She stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping her lips. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing brown eyes that seemed to hold both terror and exhaustion in their depths. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Don't take me back." Ezra felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he'd tried to bury along with his past. "Nobody's taking you anywhere you don't want to go," he said firmly. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she managed, before her eyes rolled back and unconsciousness claimed her again. Ezra looked around at the worsening storm. The wind was picking up and the temperature was dropping fast. If he left her here while he went for help, she'd be dead within the hour. There was only one choice, really, though it went against every instinct he'd developed about staying uninvolved in other people's troubles. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her carefully, then lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, probably hadn't been eating regularly. The thought made his jaw clench with anger. He didn't want to examine too closely. "Easy, Ghost," he murmured to his horse as he approached. "We're going to be carrying double for a while." Getting Sarah onto the horse was a challenge, but Ezra managed to secure her in front of him, her unconscious form leaning back against his chest. He could feel how cold she was even through his shirt, and he urged Ghost into as fast a pace as the treacherous conditions would allow. His cabin was still 3 hours away in good weather. In this storm with an injured woman it would take much longer, but as he felt Sarah shiver against him, Ezra McKinnon made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He would get her to safety no matter what it cost him. The snow continued to fall, covering their tracks as they disappeared into the white wilderness. Thoskintigiwes Ezra's cabin sat in a small clearing, backed against a rocky outcropping that provided shelter from the worst of the mountain winds. It was a modest structure, built from lodgepole pine, with a stone chimney that was currently sending a thin trail of smoke into the storm-darkened sky. He'd left a fire burning in the hearth before his trip to town for supplies, a trip that had been interrupted by finding Sarah. Getting her inside and onto his narrow bed was easier than the journey had been, but not by much. Sarah had drifted in and out of consciousness during the ride, sometimes mumbling words he couldn't quite catch, other times crying out as if reliving some nightmare. Each sound had made something tighten in Ezra's chest, a protective instinct he thought he'd lost years ago. Now as he lit the oil lamp and got his first clear look at her injuries, that protective instinct blazed into something approaching fury. The welts on her back were clearly from a whip, probably a bullwhip, judging by the distinctive marks. Some of the cuts had reopened during her escape, staining the back of her dress with fresh blood. Her wrists showed rope burns, and there was a purple bruise along her left cheek that spoke of a recent blow. "What kind of animal does this to a woman?" he muttered, carefully cutting away the ruined fabric of her dress with his skinning knife. Sarah stirred as the cool air hit her wounds. "No," she whispered, trying to pull away. "Please, I'll work harder. I'll do better." "Easy now," Ezra said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you here." Her eyes opened, and for a moment they were wild with panic. Then she seemed to register his face, the rustic interior of the cabin, the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. "Where am I?" she asked, trying to sit up. "My cabin, about 15 miles southwest of Pine Ridge." Ezra had heated water in a basin and was preparing to clean her wounds. "I found you in the snow. You've been unconscious for most of 4 hours." Sarah's hand went instinctively to her back, and she winced at the movement. "They're looking for me," she said, fear creeping into her voice. "If they find me here, they'll hurt you too. Let me worry about that." Ezra wrung out a clean cloth in the warm water. "This is going to sting, but those cuts need cleaning, or they'll fester." As he began to gently clean the wounds, Sarah's story came out in fragments. She'd been working at the Hartwell Ranch, about 20 miles north, along with a dozen other people who'd found themselves trapped in what amounted to indentured servitude. "We were told it was farm work," she explained, gripping the edge of the mattress as Ezra worked. "Room, board and wages. But once we got there," she shuddered. "Magnus Hartwell, he runs the place like it's his own private kingdom. The workers live in a bunkhouse with no heat, barely enough food to keep us alive. Anyone who complains or tries to leave gets the whip." "How long were you there?" Ezra asked, applying a poultice made from herbs he'd learned to use during his years in the wilderness. 8 months. I tried to leave twice before, but they caught me both times." Her voice grew smaller. "This time was different. There's a new girl there, Jenny. She can't be more than 16. When Hartwell started looking at her the way he looked at the others," Sarah's voice broke. "I knew I had to get out and find help." Ezra's hands stilled on her back. "What do you mean, the way he looked at the others?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "The women there, we're not just farm workers, Mr. McKinnon. Ezra McKinnon. Mr. McKinnon, we're prisoners, and some of the prisoners—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Ezra understood, and the understanding filled him with a cold rage that made his hands tremble slightly. "I was 3 miles from the ranch when the storm hit," Sarah continued. "I thought I was going to die out there. I almost wanted to, but then I thought about Jenny and the others, and I kept going until I couldn't anymore." Ezra finished bandaging her back and helped her into one of his clean shirts. It was far too large for her, but it was warm and dry. As he tucked blankets around her, he found himself studying her face. Even exhausted and injured, there was strength there, a determination that had kept her alive in circumstances that would have broken many people. "Rest now," he said, settling into a chair by the fire. "We'll figure out what to do in the morning." "You don't understand," Sarah said, her eyes already heavy with exhaustion. "Hartwell has the sheriff in his pocket, has most of the town council too. There's nowhere to run that he won't find me." "Maybe," Ezra replied, checking the load in his rifle, "but he'll have to get through me first." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, something had shifted. Ezra McKinnon, who had spent years avoiding human connection, found himself committed to protecting a woman he'd known for less than a day. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, he sat by the fire and began planning what might be the most dangerous thing he'd done since the war. The mountain man's solitary life was about to become very complicated indeed. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Rocky Mountains, the storm having finally exhausted itself sometime before sunrise. Ezra had spent most of the night sitting by the fire, rifle across his knees, listening to Sarah's restless sleep and the sounds of the wilderness beyond his cabin walls. Every crack of a branch, every howl of the wind made him tense, expecting to hear the sound of horses approaching. Sarah stirred as the pale morning light filtered through the cabin's single window. She tried to sit up, then gasped as the movement pulled at the wounds on her back. "Take it slow," Ezra said, moving to help her. "You lost a lot of blood yesterday." "How long was I asleep?" Sarah asked, accepting the cup of coffee he offered her. The warmth felt like heaven in her cold hands. "About 6 hours. Not nearly enough, but we can't stay here." Ezra moved to the window, scanning the forest beyond. "Hartwell's men will be tracking you. The storm covered your trail last night, but come morning they'll pick it up again. Sarah's face paled. Then I should go. I won't bring trouble to your door, Mr. McKinnon. You've already done more than enough. You're not going anywhere alone, Ezra said firmly. In your condition, you wouldn't make it 5 miles. Besides, I've been thinking about what you told me last night. About that ranch, about the others still trapped there. He turned from the window to face her, and Sarah was struck by the intensity in his dark eyes. This was a man who had made a decision, and she sensed that Ezra McKinnon didn't make decisions lightly. There's a federal marshal in Denver, he continued, name of Tom Sullivan. Fought alongside him during the war. He's one of the few lawmen left who can't be bought. Ezra began gathering supplies from around the cabin. Jerky, hardtack, ammunition. If we can get you to him, tell him what's happening at Hartwell's place. He'll investigate. Denver's over 100 miles from here, Sarah protested. Through mountain passes that are probably snowed in. Not all of them. There's a route through Bear Creek Pass that stays clear most of the winter. It's dangerous and it'll take us the better part of 3 days, but it's our best chance. Sarah watched him pack with efficient, practiced movements. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. This isn't your fight. Ezra paused in his packing, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words he wasn't sure he wanted to say. Maybe it should have been my fight a long time ago, he said finally. Maybe if more people stood up to men like Hartwell, there'd be fewer of them in the world. There was pain in his voice, old pain that spoke of regrets and missed chances. Sarah didn't press him for details, but she felt a connection to this gruff mountain man who was willing to risk his life for strangers. Within an hour, they were ready to leave. Ezra had fashioned a travois from pine branches and rope, a makeshift stretcher that Ghost could pull behind him. Sarah protested that she could ride, but when she tried to stand, her legs nearly buckled. The blood loss, Ezra explained, helping her onto the travois and covering her with furs and blankets. Oh, your body needs time to recover. This way you can rest while we travel. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Sarah took one last look at the cabin that had been her sanctuary. Will you ever come back here? Ezra swung into the saddle, his expression unreadable. Probably not. Places like this, they're only safe as long as nobody knows about them. After today, too many people will know. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. By saving her, Ezra was giving up the solitary life he'd built in these mountains. The weight of that sacrifice settled on her shoulders like another burden to carry. They rode in relative silence for the first hour, following a narrow game trail that wound between towering pines and over frozen streams. The travois bounced and jolted over the uneven ground, but Ezra had built it well, and Sarah found herself able to rest despite the movement. It was near midday when they heard the first sounds of pursuit. Ezra reined in Ghost immediately, his head cocked toward the sound echoing through the forest behind them. Dogs. At least 3 of them, and they were getting closer. Bloodhounds, he said grimly. Hartwell came prepared. Sarah struggled to sit up on the travois. How far behind are they? Maybe an hour, probably less. Ezra was already moving, urging Ghost toward a rocky outcropping that rose from the forest floor like the spine of some ancient beast. We need to break our trail, and we need to do it now. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Sarah's life. Ezra guided Ghost across bare rock and through icy streams, doing everything he could to confuse the scent trail they were leaving behind. Twice they had to backtrack when the terrain became too dangerous for the travois, and all the while the baying of the hounds grew closer. Finally, they reached a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountainside. The walls were steep and treacherous, but there was a ledge about halfway up that could shelter them from view. "Can you climb?" Ezra asked, studying Sarah's pale face. "I'll manage," she said, though they both knew it would be agony with her injuries. It took them precious minutes to get Sarah and their supplies up to the ledge, leaving Ghost hidden in a grove of pines at the canyon's mouth. They had barely settled into their hiding place when the first of Hartwell's men appeared at the canyon's entrance. There were 6 of them, hard-looking men with the predatory air of wolves. Their leader, a tall man with a scarred face, dismounted and studied the ground, while the bloodhounds circled frantically, having lost the scent at the rocky stream crossing. "Trail goes cold here, boss," one of the men called out. The scarred man, Sarah recognized him as Caleb Morrison, Hartwell's foreman and enforcer, spat into the snow. "They're here somewhere. That mountain man thinks he's clever, but nobody disappears from Caleb Morrison." From their perch on the ledge, Sarah and Ezra watched as the men spread out, searching for any sign of their passage. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, and she pressed herself against the cold stone, terrified that even her breathing might give them away. One of the searchers passed directly below their hiding spot, so close that Sarah could have reached out and touched his hat. She held her breath until her lungs burned, not daring to exhale until he had moved on. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Morrison called his men back. "We're losing light and there's another storm coming in. We'll make camp and pick up the trail in the morning." As the men rode away to find shelter, Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe. Beside her, Ezra remained tense, his rifle ready. "They'll be back," he whispered, "and tomorrow they'll search more carefully." Sarah nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. Their head start was gone, and now they were in a race against time and weather. The next 2 days would determine whether they reached Denver alive, or whether Hartwell's men would drag her back to a fate worse than death. As darkness fell over the canyon, Sarah found herself wondering if Ezra McKinnon's kindness had doomed them both. So it that the second storm hit just after midnight, and it came with a vengeance that made the previous night's weather seem gentle by comparison. Wind screamed through the canyon like a living thing, driving snow so hard it felt like needles against exposed skin. Sarah huddled deeper into the furs Ezra had wrapped around her, grateful for the partial shelter the rocky ledge provided. Ezra sat with his back against the stone wall, his rifle cradled in his arms, still watching for any sign of Morrison's men, despite the impossible visibility. Every few minutes he would glance over at Sarah, checking to make sure she was still conscious, still breathing. "Tell me about before," Sarah said quietly, needing the sound of a human voice to fight off the despair that kept trying to settle over her like the falling snow. "Before what?" Ezra's voice was barely audible over the wind. "Before you came to the mountains. Before you decided the company of men wasn't worth the pain." Ezra was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. "I had a farm," he said, "down in Kansas near Lawrence. Met my wife, Mary, at a church social when I was 22. She was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen, with red hair and a laugh that could light up a room." His voice softened with the memory. "We were married 6 months later." Sarah heard the past tense and felt her heart sink. She'd wondered what had driven this man to such complete isolation, and now she was beginning to understand. "We had 5 good years," Ezra continued. "Built the farm up from nothing, talked about having children. Then the war came, and Kansas was bleeding long before Fort Sumter." The wind howled around them, and Ezra paused, lost in memories that still had the power to wound him. "I joined up with the Union forces, thought I'd be home by Christmas, left Mary with her brother's family for safety." His hands tightened on the rifle. "I was with Sherman during his march, saw things, did things. A man shouldn't have to carry those memories." Sarah wanted to reach out to him, to offer some comfort, but she sensed he wasn't finished, that this was a story he'd never told anyone. "Got word near the end of '64 that raiders had hit Lawrence. Quantrill's men, or maybe just bandits, using the war as an excuse to rob and kill. When I finally made it home," Ezra's voice cracked slightly, "there wasn't much left. The house was burned, the livestock stolen or killed, and Mary—" He stopped, unable to continue. In the dim light reflected off the snow, Sarah could see the pain etched in every line of his face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Found her in what was left of the root cellar. She'd hidden there, but they found her anyway. The things they did." He shook his head. "I buried her under the oak tree where we used to sit and plan our future. Then I sold what was left of the land and came west. Been running from that day ever since." The silence that followed was filled with the storm's fury and the weight of shared pain. Sarah understood now why Ezra had chosen isolation, why he'd built his life around avoiding human connection. She also understood why he couldn't walk away from her situation, couldn't let Hartwell continue to hurt innocent people. "She would have been proud of what you're doing," Sarah said finally, "helping me, trying to save the others." "Would she?" Ezra's laugh was bitter. "I spent 15 years hiding in these mountains, while men like Hartwell preyed on people who couldn't fight back. If I'd acted sooner, if I'd cared about something other than my own pain—" "You're acting now. That's what matters." They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. The storm began to ease slightly as dawn approached, the wind dropping from a scream to a moan. "We should move soon," Ezra said, scanning the lightening sky. Morrison will be on our trail again as soon as there's enough light to track. Sarah tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The wounds on her back had stiffened during the cold night, and every movement was agony. I don't know if I can— You can, Ezra said firmly. You've already survived 8 months of hell and made it this far. Don't quit on me now. Something in his tone made Sarah look at him more closely. In the grey dawn light, she could see that he was watching her with an intensity that went beyond mere concern for a fellow human being. Somewhere during their shared night of revelations, something had shifted between them. Ezra, she began, not sure what she wanted to say. He held up a hand, cutting her off. Listen. At first, Sarah heard nothing but the wind. Then gradually she became aware of a new sound, the distant baying of hounds carried on the morning air. They're coming, Ezra said grimly, and they're closer than I expected. The next few minutes were a blur of hurried activity. Ezra helped Sarah down from the ledge, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through her back. They reached Ghost just as the first of Morrison's men appeared at the far end of the canyon. There! One of them shouted, raising his rifle. The shot echoed off the canyon walls as Ezra threw himself into the saddle, pulling Sarah up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his back as Ghost lunged forward, driven by the urgency in his rider's voice. More shots rang out behind them as they raced through the forest, weaving between trees and leaping over fallen logs. Sarah could feel Ezra's muscles tense with each near miss, could hear him talking to Ghost in a low, steady voice, guiding the horse through terrain that would have challenged an experienced rider under the best of conditions. A branch whipped past Sarah's head, close enough to tear at her hair. Ghost's hooves skidded on icy ground, and for a terrifying moment, she thought they were going to fall. But Ezra's skilled horsemanship kept them upright, kept them moving. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter but never disappeared entirely. Morrison's men knew these mountains too, and they wouldn't give up easily. As they crested a ridge and began the descent toward Bear Creek Pass, Sarah realized that the next day would likely determine whether they lived or died. The pass was treacherous in good weather, potentially deadly in winter, but it was their only chance to reach Denver, and the federal marshal who might be able to stop Hartwell's reign of terror. She tightened her grip on Ezra's waist, drawing strength from his solid presence. Whatever happened in the next 24 hours, they would face it together. The mountain man who had chosen isolation had found something worth fighting for, and the broken woman who had lost all hope had found someone willing to believe in her. The sun climbed higher in the sky as they rode toward an uncertain future, two damaged souls bound together by circumstance and growing into something neither had expected: hope. Bear Creek Pass stretched before them like the jagged spine of a sleeping giant, its narrow trail winding treacherously between peaks that scraped the gray Colorado sky. Ghost's breath came in great white puffs as he picked his way carefully along the icy path, every step potentially their last if the horse lost his footing on the frozen ground. Sarah clung to Ezra's back, her strength nearly spent after 2 days of hard riding. The wounds from Hartwell's whip had reopened during their flight, and she could feel blood seeping through the bandages beneath her borrowed shirt. But they were close now, so close she could almost taste freedom. How much farther? She asked, her voice hoarse from the cold mountain air. Another hour to the pass, then it's mostly downhill to the valley, Ezra replied, though concern colored his tone. Ghost was favoring his left foreleg, and Ezra suspected the horse had picked up a stone or suffered a minor injury during their desperate escape from Morrison's men. Behind them, perhaps 2 miles back, the pursuers continued their relentless chase. Morrison had proven to be as skilled a tracker as Ezra had feared, following their trail despite every trick the mountain man had employed to throw him off. As they rounded a bend in the trail, the pass opened before them, a narrow gap between 2 towering peaks, with the valley floor visible far below. But Ezra's heart sank as he saw what waited for them in the pass itself. 3 riders sat motionless on their horses, blocking the trail. Even at a distance, Ezra recognized the stocky figure of Magnus Hartwell himself, flanked by 2 of his men. They had ridden hard through the night, taking a shorter but more dangerous route to cut off the escape route. "Well," Hartwell called out as they approached, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air, "if it isn't my runaway property and her rescuer." Ezra reined Ghost to a halt about 50 yards from the men, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. "That woman isn't property, Hartwell. She's a human being, and she's free to go where she pleases. Hartwell laughed, a sound as cold as the mountain wind. Freedom? She owes me 8 months of work, plus damages for the disruption she's caused. By my calculation, that comes to about 5 years of service. Service, Sarah spat, finding her voice despite her exhaustion. You mean slavery, you mean rape and beatings and working people to death. I mean business, Hartwell replied calmly. And business is good when you know how to manage your assets properly. His eyes fixed on Ezra with predatory interest. You've caused me considerable trouble, Mountain Man. I'm thinking you might work off some of that debt yourself. I can always use another strong back. Ezra's laugh was as harsh as winter wind through bare branches. I've faced Confederate cavalry and Comanche war parties, Hartwell. You think I'm afraid of a coward who beats defenseless women? The insult hit home. Hartwell's face darkened, and his hand moved toward his sidearm. Kill the Mountain Man, he ordered his companions. But keep the woman alive. She's got lessons to learn about running away. The gunfight erupted in an instant. Ezra dove sideways off Ghost, pulling Sarah with him as bullets whined overhead. They landed hard behind a cluster of rocks, Sarah crying out as the impact jarred her injured back. Stay down, Ezra commanded, bringing his rifle to his shoulder. The crack of gunfire echoed off the mountain walls as the two sides exchanged shots. Ezra was outnumbered, but he had the advantage of better cover and superior marksmanship. His first shot took down one of Hartwell's men, spinning the man from his saddle. His second shot wounded another, sending him scrambling for cover behind his horse. But Hartwell had more men coming. The sound of approaching hoofbeats told Ezra that Morrison and the rest of the pursuit party had caught up. They would be trapped in a crossfire with no chance of escape. Ezra, Sarah said quietly, pulling at his sleeve. Not now, he replied, taking aim at Hartwell, who was using his horse for cover. Ezra, listen. The urgency in her voice made him pause. Then he heard it too. More hoofbeats, but coming from the direction of the valley below. A lot of hoofbeats moving fast up the mountain trail. Federal Marshals, a voice boomed across the pass. Drop your weapons. Marshal Tom Sullivan rode into view at the head of a dozen men, all wearing the distinctive badges of federal law enforcement. Behind them came another familiar figure, Sheriff Ben Hutchins from Pine Ridge, the one honest lawman in the territory, who had been investigating Hartwell's operations for months. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Morrison's men, caught between the marshals and Ezra's position, threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Hartwell's remaining gunmen did the same, clearly outnumbered and outgunned. Only Hartwell himself seemed unwilling to surrender. This is a territorial matter, he shouted at Sullivan. You have no jurisdiction here. Human trafficking crosses territorial lines, Sullivan replied coldly, dismounting with his rifle trained on Hartwell. Makes it federal business, and we've been investigating reports about your operation for weeks. Ezra stood slowly, helping Sarah to her feet. She swayed against him, exhaustion and blood loss finally taking their toll, but her eyes were bright with something that had been missing for 8 long months. Hope. The others, she whispered. Jenny and the rest of them at the ranch. Already taken care of, Sheriff Hutchins said, approaching with a pair of handcuffs. We raided the ranch this morning. Found 17 people being held against their will, including 4 minors. They're all safe now and receiving medical attention in Denver. As Hutchins cuffed Hartwell, the ranch's facade finally cracked. You have no idea what you're interfering with, he snarled. I have friends, political connections. I'll be out of jail before the week is over. Maybe, Sullivan acknowledged, but you'll be tried in federal court, not territorial, and the evidence we've gathered, including Miss Bennett's testimony, is pretty damning. You're looking at 20 years minimum, assuming they don't hang you for murder. Murder? Hartwell's face went pale. We found the graves, Hutchins said quietly. 7 of them, behind your ranch house. People who tried to escape or fight back, I'm guessing. The fight went out of Hartwell completely. As the marshals led him and his men away, Sarah sagged against Ezra, the adrenaline that had kept her going finally deserting her. Easy, Ezra murmured, catching her before she could fall. It's over, you're safe now. Marshal Sullivan approached them, his weathered face creased with concern. Miss, you need medical attention. We have a doctor waiting in Denver. In a moment, Sarah said, looking up at Ezra. I need to say something first. Ezra met her gaze, seeing something there he hadn't expected. Not just gratitude, but something deeper, more lasting. You saved my life, Sarah said simply. More than that, you saved my soul. I was ready to die in that snow, ready to give up on the idea that there were still good people in the world. You saved mine too, Ezra replied, surprising himself with the admission. I'd been dead inside for 15 years, just too stubborn to lie down. You reminded me what it feels like to fight for something that matters. Around them, the marshals were organizing the prisoners and preparing for the journey to Denver. But for a moment, Ezra and Sarah existed in their own small world, two damaged people who had found healing in each other's strength. What happens now? Sarah asked. Ezra was quiet for a moment, considering. His cabin was gone, his solitary life forever changed. But as he looked at Sarah, brave, resilient Sarah who had survived hell and still found the courage to hope, he realized that maybe change wasn't something to fear. Now we go to Denver, he said. You testify against Hartwell. Make sure he pays for what he's done, and after that, he smiled, the expression feeling strange on his face after so many years of grimness. After that, we figure out what comes next. Together, if you're willing. Sarah's answering smile was like sunrise after the longest night. I can't think of anything I'd like more. As they began the descent toward Denver, and whatever future awaited them, Ezra McKinnon reflected on the strange turns life could take. 3 days ago, he had been a hermit, content with his isolation and his pain. Now he was a man with something to live for again, something worth building toward. The mountain man who had carried a broken woman through 3 days of hell had discovered that sometimes salvation came not from solitude, but from the courage to let another person into your heart. Behind them, Bear Creek Pass stood silent and empty, already beginning to fill with fresh snow that would cover all traces of their passage. But the bonds forged in those mountains would endure long after the last traces of their footprints had disappeared. Justice had been served, love had been found, and two souls who had thought themselves beyond redemption had discovered that healing was possible, even in the harsh wilderness of the American frontier. The story of Ezra McKinnon and Sarah Bennett was far from over. It was just beginning.